My name is Keith Farquharson, musician, sound engineer, producer, educator. There was a gentleman called Benny Miller who had a recording studio, a small recording studio out somewhere down in Borrowdale. Somehow I ended up meeting him, and he said, okay, do you want to come to my studio? And because he knew I was interested in keyboards and that sort of stuff. I was still at school, and I was at school in South Africa at the time. So I would come up during the holidays, and he would let me come to the studio and mess around with his, his equipment and that sort of thing. When I was about 16, 17. And at the time, he had just started working with Comrade Chinx, and I think it was Marching Together, Magamba Ose, those first songs that Chinx did. They had a little 4-track recorder and a synthesizer and a drum machine, and that's how it was done. So I was obviously mesmerized by this. So then what happened was that I just happened to be around when he was recording the second song. He wanted to record Chinx's second single, which was Comrade. And then, so he said, Keith, can you come and play some keyboards on this? So I did. So a lot of that, there's obviously the melody that was there on that song. And he said, okay, great. So there was Comrade, and then I can't remember what was on the B side. And so then Chinx said to me, hey, Keith, come with me. I'm making a video at ZBC, at ZTV, and I want you to be in the video with me and that sort of thing. So that's when, so things kind of started with Chinx around then. So at the same time, Benny was recording another band. He'd already recorded a single for Ilanga. And they asked me to play some keyboards on that. The guy said, play some keyboards on this. And in fact, that is not entirely true, because Brian Paul played the keyboards on those early songs, very, very first Ilanga songs. So they said, listen, Keith, why don't we do some shows? You come with us, and obviously we will, play Chinx's songs and that sort of thing. And at the time, I had my own band, and Don and Andy were playing some of my songs. So we were already performing together as musicians. Must have been, I was about 19 at that time. And so what happened, we started playing the songs together, then we got onto stadium shows, and Chinx became very popular, Ilanga started becoming very popular. And then from there, we recorded our first album, which was Visions Foretold. So, so the story kind of, began with Chinx, and then the Ilanga kind of relationship came out of the studio environment where the first songs were being recorded. So it all started in the studio and moved on from there. I think as far as Ilanga was concerned, the highlights were, I think we recorded, after Visions Foretold, we recorded True Love as a single after that, and that just exploded. So after, with the popularity of True Love, obviously we started getting booked for some big shows, and one of those was the Human Rights Concert in '88. I think there'd been one before that, which was, I can't remember which one. It was the one with Harry Belafonte, and they came out. But the next year was the Human Rights Concert. So we got invited to perform at that. So it was Mtukudzi played first, then Ilanga, and then I think Tracy Chapman, and then the rest of them. But that was quite an exciting time for me, And I think at what was a bit strange about it was, I remember Don saying to me, Keith, you must be the spokesperson for the band. And I was 20, and I said, why? He says, yeah, because, you can speak good English and, I said, what are you talking about? So he said, no, we want you to be the spokesperson for the band, which, I mean, in hindsight was a completely stupid idea, because some of the issues that we wanted to raise, particularly in terms of the fact that, the majority of the audience were South Africans. So this, playing in Zimbabwe because they couldn't play in South Africa made no difference at all to the fact that the South African audience just came across the border and saw the show here. So the vast majority of the people, the 75,000 people in that stadium, were South Africans anyway. So there were some issues that we had with that. And, I wasn't at 20, wasn't probably the best person, best placed person to speak about that, given my, youth and lack of experience in many things. What happened at that show was that Sting's manager was a guy called Miles Copeland, who was the brother of Stuart Copeland, who was in the Police with Sting. He wasn't playing with Sting's band at the time, but the brother, so Miles Copeland ran Sting's record company. And after the gig, they came to us and said, look, would you guys like a record deal? And, because there were too many, how can I say it, disagreements and differences of opinion within the band because of the individuals concerned, we couldn't agree on it, and we lost that opportunity because we just simply couldn't agree on a way forward with it. But that could have changed a lot of things. It would have been great to have been signed to a label that would have got our music outside of Zimbabwe, which is what we wanted. So so these are kind of things that not many people know about that time and about that show. It was a great show, but it could have been for us the benefits could have been so much greater. But because of our own naivety and that we didn't make the most of them. But it's easy to say in hindsight, I guess. As far as Chinx is concerned, the highlights of that were just the fact that as an individual, and again, because as a young white guy growing up in Zimbabwe after independence and at my formative years, particularly in terms of not so much musically because I'd started playing music at an early age, but more in terms of Zimbabwean music and playing and having an understanding of that. And getting to go around the country to, everywhere. We played in all the, small taverns in rural areas to the big stadiums and all of that. And where I was welcomed as if, and the joke used to go around was, here comes David Livingstone, which was always quite funny. So, because I was there and I was playing music and everyone was just, hey, great, this is so nice. And that whole kind of reconciliation message that Mugabe was pushing at the time after independence was tangible. It was a wonderful time to get out there and be a young white guy playing music. It was a wonderful time in my life, and I think this is why, obviously, the understanding of Zimbabwean music itself, I got to see, on a regular basis, whether it was Robson Banda, it was any of these guys, Muddy Face, all of these bands that were performing at the festivals with us regularly. I obviously became very familiar with the music and had a much better understanding than perhaps if I hadn't been as exposed as I was. Which ultimately further down the line, when it came time for the technical side of things and understanding, particularly in terms of sound engineering and recording and production, understanding how to get that sound became, obviously it was already part of me. Yeah, so that was, I guess that in terms of the spin-offs and the highlights from what I got from performing with Chinx, that was, probably the thing that benefited me most was my exposure to Zimbabwean music you know, in those days when, you know, all of the big bands were, I mean, there were a lot of very big bands, Leonard Dembo, I mean, Mapfumo, all of them. We were all together on these festivals all night. We would finish at 6, 7 the next morning, you know. Yeah, so what happened over the years, once I started, you know, the whole recording thing, because remember, I'd already been involved with recording from the early days, even with Chinx. I was exposed to the recording side of things and the technical side. So we recorded, I was very much involved in the recording process with Ilanga's albums as well. And from there, after, you know, Ilanga split up, obviously I already had a recording studio, and that's when I recorded Andy Brown's first album, which was, well, not his first album, but it was, I think, one of that album that really, with Tichango Shiner, that Gondwanaland album that really, you know, gave him a lot of radio play and that sort of thing. So the recording thing had already started. So the recording studio of mine and that sort of thing had already started. So by the time I was, you know, I kind of moved through the 90s, I was already recording different people. I got involved after that with Mtukudzi as first of all as his keyboard player, and that was around the time of Tuku music. That particular album, which obviously took him elsewhere in the world, and that started, you know, a lot of tours of America and Europe and that sort of thing. And that's where on the live side of things really kicked off for me as well. So I ended up stopping playing keyboards with Oliver, and I ended up his sound engineer, because I was always running out to the front to listen to what they were doing. And the sound engineer, you know, if we were at a small town in the UK or whatever, I have to say to him, no, that's not the right way to do this. And run back, play some keyboards, go back and listen to it again, make some adjustments. And eventually I said to Tuku, I said, let me go out there, let's find another keyboard player, which he agreed to. So that started my journey in terms of live sound and touring, and I toured with him, you know, for some years. So in terms of the technical side of things, that's where I started shifting into live, although I was still doing the recording and music production as well. So I think where that eventually led to was, once I was outside Zimbabwe for a while, and you know, after I left Zimbabwe and moved to London for a bit, I was still very much in touch with musicians who were sending albums to me to mix. In fact, I did a lot of the first album for Chioniso I did here with Andy Brown. Andy played on it. The second album he didn't play on. So he played on the first one, Ancient Voices, and then by then, you know, there were issues between me and Andy. So it was, we had a strange relationship. We were best friends for many years, and I mean, I guess that we still remained like that, you know, until he died. In as far as we never lost that connection. But I think his involvement in some of what Chioniso was doing, that didn't happen. So, you know, at the time when he could have really been of more assistance to her. So then I think from there I started mastering as well. And as far as the difference between mixing and mastering goes, you know, mixing someone's record is where they go into a recording studio, they with a whole lot of musicians, they record the songs, they finish the songs, and they're happy with the recordings, and then all the individual tracks, all those elements, they then send to someone else to actually to mix, to make it all to put it together and sound good. So kind of like getting all the ingredients to a cake or a recipe or whatever, and just saying to someone, here, you can bake this really, we know you're a good baker, you know, you can come up with something nice. So it's a similar, that's, you know, kind of maybe not a great analogy for music, but so that's what mixing is. And then finally, the mastering process is taking those mixes, once everyone's happy with the balance, and then really giving it some sparkle, making sure that each of the songs, let's say there's 10 songs on an album, all of them they sound consistent in terms of also the order of the songs and that sort of stuff. But that's kind of changed a little bit now with because of the fact that the album format is kind of not as important anymore as it was, because people are just putting out one song here and there. So mastering now has become more just about making sure that it sounds as good as it can and that it's at the right level, particularly for Spotify and other streaming platforms. In Ilanga, obviously for me, it also helped to shape my, my sort of kind of style as a keyboard player. And for instance, Don Gumbo was very much influenced by Ray Phiri and Stimela, which is, you can probably hear that in the songs because Stimela were exploding in South Africa at the time, and we did quite a lot of shows when they used to come up to Zimbabwe. We would often do shows with them and that sort of stuff. And that was kind of, Don loved that style. And so we ended up sounding a little bit similar to them at times. So Don was a great bass player. I mean, he played left-handed, which obviously affected his style and that sort of thing. And he was a great writer. His songs were different to Andy's. Andy had a different style of writing. Musically, Andy was probably one of the best musicians I've ever, had the opportunity to play with, because he was so versatile. He could play anything. So, like Louis Mplanga, for instance, Louis can also is the same. He can switch between rock stuff and jazz or whatever. Andy, not so much on the jazz front, but he had a very accessible guitar sound. He was very, he was a great guitar player and a good songwriter as well. So he had that ability to write stuff that the Western ear would, the pop ear rather than I would call it the Western ear really, but more sort of pop melodies, but at the same time mix that with, Zimbabwean guitar styles and that sort of thing. So that was his strength. And funnily enough, I mean, that really was Chioniso's strength as well, to be able to, in her melodies, to be able to switch and really write melodies that appealed to everybody, and to mix stuff together in such a way that it works better than it would have been in either one or the other style. So they both had a remarkable ability to do that. So I was very fortunate to work with two people like that. Then, as far as the rest of the guys in Ilanga were concerned, we went through a couple of drummers. We started with Munya Brown, who used to play with Misty and Roots, and then ended up with Transit for a long time. And then our next drummer was Gibson Nyoni. Charles Mangena was, he played percussion and did backing vocals in the band. I think he sang on one or two of the songs, maybe on the first album, certainly. When Andy left, we played with Roger Mambo. Roger was he became the guitar player for Ilanga. Busi was still there, obviously, Busi Ngube. And when Busi joined as well, it meant, especially because of the strength of True Love, that she could she could do lead vocals and that sort of stuff on a bunch of songs. So we had two lead singers. In fact, we really had three with Andy as well. So it was a very versatile band. And Vigilio Ignacio, Mozambican keyboard player, who was a much better keyboard player than I was. He had a different style than I did. So I think that worked really well, and the two of us, having two keyboard players was great, because we would play different things. So yes, it was a very enriching time musically for me to play with guys that had such diverse styles, but were all very, very talented musicians. And I think that this was one of the things that this is more an observation than anything else, a personal observation, so I mean it's personal opinion, but so bear that in mind, was that when I started playing with Oliver Mtukudzi, in terms of the way that the shows would go, in terms of the songs, the arrangements would be quite structured. So there wouldn't be solos, there wouldn't be, you wouldn't find one of the songs going on for 10 or 15 minutes because someone had decided to play some solos or someone else had decided to take it in another direction. Whereas playing with Ilanga, we were all free to explore and to go wherever we wanted to go because it was encouraged. Whereas with Tuku, it was very much, and in the band that that he had, and all the bands that he's had, depending on which musicians have been playing in them, they've all been very, very structured, and you all play the songs are played in the same way. The melodies are the same. The arrangement is relatively similar. There are some times when obviously with dancing and with stuff that, other stuff would happen. That didn't happen so much in Ilanga. We weren't a big dancing band. But musically, the arrangements were much freer with Ilanga, and the musicians were able to experiment. We were a very experimental band. The Bundu Boys material was was a lot more narrow in terms of its focus. In that particular style of Zimbabwean music was a lot narrower. So whereas for Ilanga, we played anything. We played anything, and if you look at what particularly with Andy, who took Ilanga even further in terms of experimenting with stuff, you could find anything from sungura to reggae to straight up pop to whatever it might be. It was a lot more experimental. So as a result, the styles of the individual musicians were a lot wider, in terms of versatility. Whereas the guys in Bundu Boys weren't that type of musician. If you understand what I'm saying, they were less experimental because the music didn't require you to be experimental. So whereas with Ilanga, and I guess going back to the comparison with Stimela and Ray Piri, again, that was a very experimental type of band that could take a song anywhere because the musicians just loved to play together on stage, and that was where the magic happened, more so than even the records. Yeah, I've mixed far more songs than I've mastered. I mean, the mastering thing really is just I haven't done a lot of mastering for Zimbabwean stuff. I mean, people have sent me stuff to master, but I much prefer to mix the material myself. So because often mastering is kind of fixing what someone else has done. Quite often you're required to fix what someone else has done. So most of the stuff that I've done, so for instance, all of Ja Praise's albums that I've mixed, for the most part I've mastered them as well. As far as Tuku was concerned, Sarawoga, I think I sent for mastering in the US. Some albums I've mastered myself, mixed and mastered, but I prefer to get someone else to master it just to get a different, someone else's ears to listen to it, because after I've heard a song, mixed a song, I've probably heard it 50, 60 times, and you tend to get saturated, and having someone else's ears, come along and listen to that and say, you could have adjusted these frequencies a little bit better, or you've overdone it here with something. Let me try and, it's small touches. Mastering is all about small touches to make something maybe 10, 15% better. And for most people that hear a mix and they hear a master, if it's been well mixed, the master shouldn't sound too much different to that. It's just a little bit, it's like a little flower that perhaps opens up a little bit more. But that's all it is. So for most people's ears, they listen to the mix, listen to the master. As long as it's a good song and they like it and it sounds okay, most people aren't concerned with that little extra that it's opened up. But I guess it's good to have a song sound as good as it possibly can. So. As far as Piece of Ebony goes, that started the same sort of time as I was recording Gondwanaland. So it was at the end, after Ilanga had split up, and I think some of us were still in Ilanga B, as we used to call it, the B team, after Andy left. So I was recording Andy's album, and that's when I started working with these two young guys, Herbert Schwamborn and Tony Chiota, who came to me and said, look, we've got these tracks and that. And so I came along and I put the music together to all the songs. And it was a wonderful time because it was a different sound. We had mbira in there. We had all sorts of different styles. And in the case of Chioniso, she obviously sang on the one song where I had taken an mbira sample. That's not that piece of mbira on from the native tongue is actually not. I don't even know who played it and where it came from. That was a sample that I used. So it was a lot of samples that I started using because that stuff was, all produced on machines and samplers and that sort of thing. And so songs like Pretend It Never Happened, Herbert came with these lyrics, Pretend It Never Happened. There was obviously something that had happened to him that he wanted to forget about. It was one of those sort of kind of love story thing, well, let's pretend this never happened or whatever. It's something I can't remember exactly what the rest of the lyrical content was. But so Chioniso did, sang, the female part, and then obviously all the rap parts were done by Tony and Herbert, and the music was mine. So that's really my contribution to that project was obviously the musical part of it. And, I guess limited in terms of production, you got to understand that in terms of hip hop at that time, I mean, it wasn't a big genre, certainly not for me as well. And I think that I did the best I could, but I think that if we went back and redid that record now, if Herbert were to redo that record with his hip-hop producer's hat on, given his experience since then, the record would sound completely different. So, and I think when you listen to it, there is a naivety about it, which is, it's kind of sweet. It's nice. We got signed to, it was enough to get signed to one of the big record companies in Johannesburg, in South Africa. We got signed to Teal True Tone in Joburg, and they put money, a lot of money into a music video and that sort of thing. Got the guys down to Joburg, and they got everyone got clothes and all that and dressed up for the music. It was great. They had some sponsorship and everything like that. So it was successful in that we got signed to a big record label, but I think that it was a little bit before its time, and also maybe in terms of the production, possibly to have got someone else to produce it, because it was, I think, maybe too diverse in terms of the content. But like I said, if Herbert were to produce that record again, if we were to redo it today, it would have a completely different feel because of his experience. So. Yes, so that was her introduction to the music industry in terms of getting songs heard on and getting her voice heard on radio and that. I had to go to her father to ask permission to record her because she was 15 or 16 at the time. Maybe she had just turned 16. I had to go to him and say, please, can I record your daughter? And he said, yes, just as long as you look after and it's, you can take her to the recording studio. She can record. I give it my blessing. And then from there, obviously she did all the backing vocals on Gondwanaland for Andy, her and Wendy Chibindi were the two voices on that. I can't remember. There was another another backing vocalist as well. I can't remember offhand. So that's where that started. And then shortly after that, we did her first album, which was Ancient Voices. So yes, it did kind of start for Chioniso with Piece of Ebony, but she had already been performing as part of the Maraire sort of Mbira ensemble with her, her sisters and brother and that. She'd already been doing that since a young age. So she was already out there, but I think that the Piece of Ebony album really kind of put a voice onto radio that people could say, oh, who is this now? And remember, I guess that from there, at 16, she just grew and grew in terms of her, her songwriting ability and her style and everything like that, which, we all know is, probably one of the finest voices ever to come out of Zimbabwe. As far as keyboards, and the keyboard within the sound of the keyboard and how it's used within Zimbabwean music in particular, I mean, if going back to the days of when Comrade Chinx started, doing his songs with Benny Miller, and we were using synthesizers and drum machines and those analog synthesizers. Remember, they'd already been used in Zimbabwean music, more in like the Green Arrows. Material. So there was that synthesizer sound had already started, appearing in the sounds of some of those, like some of the Green Arrows stuff. And then with Chinx, what happened was the kind of the drum machine sounds and some of those little analog synths, formed the basis of his sound. And now I was very into that. So I came along from, I was at school in South Africa, and I managed to convince my parents somehow to, buy me a synthesizer. And I came, back to Zimbabwe with that. And that's where, when Ilanga started, I was playing, those kind of synthesizer sounds, more so than pianos and organs and that sort of thing. It was like synth sounds with melodies and interesting stuff like that. Obviously, as a keyboard player, I developed and I liked playing the piano anyway, so I started integrating piano sounds and a lot of organ and that sort of stuff. But again, still with a lot of synthesizer sounds there, and some of those sounds that you will still hear, you hear now in dance music, in electronic dance music, are still there, because it's, synthesizers have been around for a while and they're not going away. So, and I was also using samples. So the way that I used keyboards, really, I would use any kind of sound that worked. Whereas I think with Bundu Boys, it was, again, a little bit more narrow in terms of the choice of sounds. Same thing with when I was playing keyboards with Oliver Mtukudzi, it was limited to probably 5 or 6 sounds that worked with the music, but no, crazy Moog, synthesizer solo sounds, which were, in Andy Brown's band, sounded perfectly, in place. But for Tuku, to play that in one of Mtukudzi's songs, it wasn't quite right. So, so it was, again, that narrowness in terms of the focus for that particular style is really what it was all about. So, in the more experimental stuff I did, obviously, I was able to express myself with a synthesizer a little bit more. As far as that's concerned, what I do hear a lot, and also in terms of the one particular thing that I have noticed is the brass sounds from Andy Brown and Chioniso. The brass sort of kind of sounds that I used in the style, that I hear a lot in certain artists. I hear that quite a lot. That's one example. So yes, I guess that it does. It does find other spaces. It does trickle into other people's music. So I guess there has been some kind of influence in terms of what people have heard and thought, we like that. That works. Let me play something like that. But yeah, the music is there to listen to. So I guess influence is in that.